Somewhere across the grasslands of Asia, stretching from the coast of Korea to the shores of the Caspian Sea, one man assembled the largest connected empire the world has ever known, and he did it in a single lifetime. The textbooks tell you what came next. A fierce, nomadic people erupted out of the steppe, conquered half the known world, and then somehow dissolved, leaving behind ruins, legends, and almost nothing else. A people who rose, who conquered, and who vanished. For a long time, that was the story. Then ancient DNA was pulled from the graves of their elite, and when the results came back, almost every part of that story buckled. The Mongols were never the single people we were told they were. The most famous fact about their bloodline is now coming apart, and the vanishing never happened at all. To understand what the DNA overturned, you first have to understand what it was overturning. And that means going back to a cold corner of the world where the empire began, to a child born into a people who were not yet a people at all. In the year 1162, on the grasslands of what is now Mongolia, a son was born to the leader of a minor clan. His father named him Temüjin, after a man he had captured on the day of the birth, a way of announcing to everyone watching that the father was a strong man and that the son would grow into one too. In that world, prestige of this kind was not vanity, it was politics. It was the difference between commanding men and being commanded. The boy lost everything early. When he was 9, his father was killed, and Temüjin was too young to hold power. Another clan seized the leadership, and the child who would one day rule the world was left with nothing but a grievance and a vengeance. To make good on that vow, he needed an army, and so over the years he gathered one, warrior by warrior, alliance by alliance, marriage by marriage, until he was strong enough to turn on the clans that had cast him out and break them one by one. But the thing that set him apart was not his appetite for conquest. Other Mongols had that. What set him apart was how he chose the men around him. Across the steppe, power was inherited. A foolish uncle could command an army, while a brilliant foot soldier stayed in the ranks, simply because of who his family was. Temüjin tore that up. He promoted by ability, not by blood. A nobody who could lead men could rise to general, and a man who owed his entire standing to Temüjin became the most loyal man he had. The result was an organization that was both ruthlessly competent and bound to him personally, and it made his people unstoppable. By the year 1206, the surviving clans understood there was no fighting it. They gathered, and rather than be conquered, they handed him a title, Genghis Khan, the great Khan of all Mongols. And from that moment, the empire had a single rule written into its foundation. The army rewarded merit, but the throne did not. Only the blood of Genghis Khan could rule. One family, locked at the very top of a machine built on talent. This is the picture the textbooks settled on. A distinct nomadic people, the Mongols, one bloodline and one culture, pouring out of the steppe as a single race and stamping themselves across the world before fading back into it. A people rose, a people conquered, a people vanished. It is a tidy shape, and it is repeated in classrooms and documentaries everywhere. The problem is that nearly all of it was assembled long before anyone could read the bones. For most of the time we have studied the Mongols, the most important evidence was the one thing we could not read: the bones themselves. The actual biological record of who these people were, where they came from, and who they became, sat in the ground and in museum drawers, silent. Everything we thought we knew was built without it. Instead, we built the story from words. We had the chronicles written by the people the Mongols conquered, accounts soaked in terror and exaggeration, written by men who had every reason to paint the horsemen as a single faceless horde. We had the secret history of the Mongols, their own founding account, part record and part legend. We had pottery, grave goods, the shapes of weapons, the layout of camps. Historians did the best they could with what they had, and what they had was a portrait assembled from the outside, by enemies and by inference. It was a story told about the Mongols far more than it was a story told by their own remains. Then the tools changed. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists take genetic material from skeletons that have been in the ground for centuries, sometimes for thousands of years, sequence it, and compare it against the genomes of people living today. From a fragment of bone, they can reconstruct who a person was, which populations they descended from, and how they are related to the people walking the same land now. It is, in every meaningful sense, a time machine made of bone. And for most of the 20th century, it simply did not exist. In the 2010s and 2020s, that changed. Sequencing reached a level of precision that allowed researchers to pull readable genetic material from steppe remains and from burials scattered across the old empire, and to do something no chronicle could ever do: to check the story against the bodies. But the Mongols presented a problem that almost no other civilization does. There was no grave to test against. The most important set of bones in the entire story, the remains of Genghis Khan himself, has never been found. According to the traditions surrounding his death, his burial was hidden deliberately and completely. The men who carried his body are said to have killed anyone they met along the way, and then to have been killed in turn, so that no one alive would know the location. The tomb of the man who reshaped the world was erased on purpose, and it has stayed erased for 800 years. So the geneticists did the next best thing. If they could not read the founder, they would read the people he left behind, his descendants, the lineages that ruled in his name for centuries, his armies, scattered across thousands of miles of conquered land, the elites buried in stone tombs from Kazakhstan to the Mongolian plateau. The blood of the dynasty and the blood of the horde were still in the ground, waiting. And the first thing those bones revealed was that the Mongol people were never a people at all. Start with the deep history of the steppe, because that is where the first illusion falls apart. When researchers sequenced more than 200 ancient genomes spanning 6,000 years of life on the Mongolian grasslands, they did not find a single enduring bloodline. They found layer upon layer of arrival, mixing, and replacement. The steppe was never the cradle of one race. It was a crossroads, and it had been one for millennia before Genghis Khan was born. The clearest proof comes from the empire that ruled the same grasslands 1,000 years before the Mongols. The Xiongnu, the first great nomadic power of the steppe, the rival that frightened imperial China into building its wall. When their elite burials were sequenced, the result overturned every assumption about what a steppe empire was. The Xiongnu were not a people. They were multi-ethnic, carrying a sweep of genetic diversity so wide it appeared not just across the empire, but inside single extended families buried together. And there was a stranger detail still. The widest diversity of all was found among the lowest servants, while the highest power was concentrated in narrow, specific lineages, an empire of many bloodlines ruled by a few. This was the template, and the Mongols inherited it. Because the thing that made the Mongol Empire was never breeding. It was assimilation. Their entire way of life was a machine for turning other people into Mongols. They lived in vast mobile groups called hordes, and when they conquered a tribe, they did not let the survivors stay together. They scattered them. Each family was forced to pitch its tent among Mongol families, surrounded on every side, with no one of their own to speak their language or keep their customs. Within a generation, the children of the conquered grew up Mongol, because there was nothing else left to be. Whole peoples had their identity dissolved and replaced, deliberately, as a matter of policy. And the machine ran in every direction. Turkic peoples were absorbed. Chinese engineers and bureaucrats were folded in. Persians and Uyghurs ruled provinces in the Khan's name. The Mongols even took the assimilation method itself from the Turks and the engines of siege warfare from the Chinese, swallowing the useful parts of every culture they swallowed. The horde that rode out of the steppe at the end was not the horde that had ridden in. It had been added to, layered, rebuilt, again and again. So when the chronicles speak of the Mongols as a single, ferocious race pouring across Asia, the DNA answers plainly. There was no single race. The word Mongol was never a bloodline. It was a political identity, an allegiance, a uniform that could be put on a conquered man until his grandchildren forgot they had ever worn anything else. The empire was not the spread of one people. It was an act of relentless assembly, gathering dozens of peoples under one name and one rule. Which raises the obvious question: if the people were never one, what about the one thing everyone is still certain of? The bloodline of the conqueror himself. In the year 2003, a team of geneticists published a finding that would become the most famous fact in the entire field of ancestry. They had studied the Y chromosomes of thousands of men across Asia, and they had found something they could not easily explain. A single male lineage, one specific genetic signature carried by roughly 8% of all the men living across the lands of the old Mongol Empire. Scaled to the whole world, that came to about 0.5% of all men alive, 1 in every 200. An estimated 16 million living descendants of a single man. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand the Y chromosome. It passes from father to son almost entirely unchanged, generation after generation, picking up only tiny random mutations along the way. It is, in effect, a surname written in biology. Two men who carry the same Y signature share a father somewhere back along the line, however many centuries ago that father lived. And this particular signature was shared by millions. Everything about it pointed in one direction. The mutations placed its origin around 1,000 years ago. Its geography traced the borders of the Mongol Empire almost exactly as if someone had drawn the map of conquest in living blood. And the timing matched a single dynasty that had every means to spread itself. Genghis Khan and his sons held many wives and many concubines, and the rule written into the empire's foundation guaranteed that only his male line could rule. For centuries, his descendants sat at the top of half of Asia, fathering children across an entire continent, a lineage built not by chance, but by power, exactly the social machine the founder had designed. The human anchor for the whole theory lived in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Hazara people had told the same story about themselves for generations, an oral tradition that they were the descendants of Mongol soldiers, men of Genghis Khan's armies who had settled and stayed. And when their DNA was read, the tradition held. The signature appeared among Hazara men at an extraordinary rate, in some measures close to 1/3 of them. A people who had always said they carried the conqueror in their blood, and who turned out to be right. It was the Hazara who first cracked the connection open and pointed researchers toward the Khan, so the story hardened into fact. One man, the most prolific father in human history, his bloodline stamped across a continent. It went into documentaries and textbooks and headlines, repeated so often it stopped sounding like a hypothesis and started sounding like a law of nature. But there was a quiet problem underneath it, and it never went away. Every piece of that case was indirect. The timing, the geography, the breeding patterns of the dynasty, all of it was inference. No one had ever compared that signature to Genghis Khan himself, because no one has ever found Genghis Khan. The bones that could confirm or break the legend were missing. And then, in the highlands of Kazakhstan, something arrived that could finally test it. The test came from central Kazakhstan, from a range of highlands called Ulitau, where 4 medieval stone tombs had stood for centuries above the open steppe. The local people had always known what they were. Folklore held that these were the graves of the Golden Horde, the northwestern wing of the empire, the lands founded by Joki, the eldest son of Genghis Khan, and ruled by his descendants for generations after him. And one tomb carried a claim heavier than the rest. The tradition insisted it held the remains of Joki himself, the firstborn of the conqueror. For a long time, those were only stories. Then, working with their Kazakh partners, researchers extracted ancient DNA from the burials, and for the first time they could test the folklore against the bodies. The first half of the result confirmed everything. 3 of the men in the tombs were related to one another through the male line, paternally linked across the same family. When their ancestry was traced, it ran firmly back to the Mongolian plateau, the heartland the empire had come from, even though these men had died and been buried more than 1,000 miles to the west. And they carried it. The C3 star cluster, the Y chromosome signature long tied to the Mongol Empire and to the legend of Genghis Khan's descendants. The folklore had been right. These were Genghisid elites, members of the ruling dynasty, lying exactly where the oral tradition said they would be. That alone was a remarkable confirmation. But then came the part that unsettled the popular story. When the researchers looked closely at which branch of the cluster these elite men actually carried, they found that it sat on a narrower limb of the family tree than expected, and that this precise branch appears in living populations today at a much lower frequency than the famous figure assumes. This is something only ancient DNA can do. In a modern blood sample, 2 branches that split long ago can look almost identical, blurred together into a single signature. But with genetic material pulled straight from the dynasty's own bones, scientists could finally tell those branches apart. And once they could, the simple picture began to fracture. The idea that 1 in 200 men carries the exact line of a single superfather no longer held together so cleanly. The lineage was real. It did spread, and it spread widely. But the bones suggest it spread the way an empire spreads, through a broad web of related Mongol men and through centuries of a dominant ruling dynasty fathering children across a continent, not through one impossibly prolific individual seeding 16 million identical descendants. The legend was not invented. It was just smaller and more tangled and more human than the myth had allowed. A single set of tombs cannot settle the question of Genghis Khan's bloodline on its own, and the researchers were the first to say so. But for the first time, the story was being tested against something other than inference. It was being tested against the dynasty's own remains. And the bones were the first thing precise enough to say the legend had been overgrown. The empire did not fall all at once. It came apart the way it had been built, in pieces, across the whole of a continent. After the early Khans, the succession wars grew longer and bloodier, until choosing a ruler meant fighting a civil war. By the middle of the 13th century, the empire had split into 4, and the 4 turned on each other. In the east, the Mongols who ruled China settled into Beijing, took a Chinese name and Chinese governance, and slowly stopped being Mongols at all, until floods and plague and rebellion drove the rest of them back to the steppe. In the west, the Golden Horde fractured into feuding clans, while the Russians it had ruled quietly gathered strength, until Moscow rose and the overlords became the subjects. In Central Asia, the Mongols simply stayed, lived among the people they had conquered for 5 centuries, and became farmers and city dwellers. And everywhere, gunpowder ended the world of the horse archer because no rider could reload a musket at a gallop. The textbooks call this the vanishing. The empire gone, the horsemen faded back into the grass, the Mongols dissolved into history and out of it. The same clean ending the whole story had always promised. A people who rose, conquered, and disappeared. But that was never what happened, because the dissolution was not a disappearance. It was the assimilation machine running in reverse. The Mongols had spent 2 centuries dissolving other peoples into themselves, scattering the conquered until their grandchildren forgot what they had been. And when the empire ended, the very same thing happened to them. They were absorbed by the peoples they had ruled, folded into Chinese cities and Russian principalities and Central Asian towns, until the name on the outside changed and the blood underneath simply carried on. They did not evaporate. They were taken back in. And this is the part the DNA confirms, the thing the oral traditions and the genealogies had been saying for centuries while the textbooks looked away. The Mongols are not gone. Their descendants are Kazakh and Uzbek, Russian and Ukrainian, Hazara and Mongolian, scattered across the same vast stretch of Eurasia the empire once held. The signature of the ruling dynasty still sits in the blood of millions of men from the Pacific to the Caspian. Modern Mongolians still carry the layered, mixed inheritance of every people the steppe ever absorbed, the Western threads tangled in with the Eastern, exactly as 6,000 years of arrival and mixing would predict. The people were called vanished while their descendants farmed the same grasslands, watered the same rivers, and carried the conquerors in their bodies the entire time. The horde that rode out of Mongolia was an assembly of many peoples wearing one name, and when the name fell away, the peoples remained, exactly where they had always been. The empire ended. The bloodlines did not. And the only thing that ever truly disappeared was the tidy story we told ourselves about where everyone had gone. The textbooks gave the Mongols a clean and simple shape. One people, one bloodline, one disappearance, and the bones dismantled all 3. They were never a single race. They were a political machine that turned the conquered into Mongols and were turned back into the conquered when the machine stopped running. The most famous fact about Genghis Khan's blood turns out to be real, but smaller and stranger than the legend, and only the graves of his dynasty were ever precise enough to say so. And they never vanished. They are standing in plain sight, in the faces and the blood of more than 100 million people across Eurasia, on the same grasslands they always held. The real mystery of the Mongols was never where they went. It was how anyone ever managed to convince themselves they were gone.